Hi, this is Dwayne Gundrum again. We're going to be talking about ethical communication today. Ethics comes from Aristotle in his book Ethics. What he was looking for in that particular book is why do people actually do the things they do? Not as are people moral or immoral. That comes a little bit later with Plato when Socrates is looking into justice. Now, what we're talking about today, as I said, is ethical communication and why do people do what they actually do? And more importantly, once you figure out why they're doing what they're doing, and you have no idea why it just turned negative, wouldn't it be nice if you can kind of figure out somebody beforehand or during a conversation like this that does go sour and goes south really fast, if you could figure out why it did it and possibly use that information to turn things around so that conversation doesn't end up as negative as it possibly could be? Think of it as a primer to be used to try to figure people out. Imagine, if you will, trying to understand someone based on their personal perspective rather than reacting to that person's actions at any particular time and hoping you can come up with the right type of response. I'll give you an example. You're in a meeting, and it's a meeting for healthcare, and you're the person who's been given the job that they need to walk in there and pretty much figure out the budget for the future. Now, you've spent all night trying to figure out what you have to do, what you have to research, what you have to everything that you have to do in order to save money for the next fiscal year. You walk into that meeting, you've got all these great ideas, you thought about it all night, and you're pretty sure you know what you're actually talking about, and suddenly you find yourself on the defensive by everybody, and you have no idea why that actually is. So you start to think about it, and you go, okay, and you try to respond, and you try to somehow get yourself out of this situation, but you find it's not actually working out. What you've discovered is a whole bunch of people that think in one particular way, and in this particular case, we're talking about a care response. So say next time you go into another meeting pretty much convinced, okay, I understood what happened last time, and I'm going to walk into this next one pretty much knowing what happened last time, and you happen to be meeting with a bunch of people, say, in the military. And you try using the same kinds of things that you've tried to figure out didn't work last time, but now might work this time because you're now compensating for what happened in that last meeting, and you suddenly find yourself on the defensive again. Well, what you found out is the people basically in the military don't always have the exact same kind of responses that people who have a care perspective might actually have, or the care response. And so they have what's actually called a duty response, which if you think about it, it kind of equates to discipline and getting the job done. And so if you walked into that situation understanding that, then you might actually have had better results. Surprisingly, the kinds of things you went in with that first meeting probably would have worked a lot better in that second meeting. Are you starting to get the idea of how ethical communication kind of works? If you understand their basic paradigm of kind of where they come from, or where people generally come from, then things kind of work out a little bit better if you kind of deal with people on that nature. Now, do keep in mind, there is a kind of important nuance to this whole process that you got to kind of keep in mind as well. And that's the idea that not everyone always falls into that exact kind of response process. So just because you prepared for, say, a healthcare response with a bunch of people who are in healthcare, you may end up with a bunch of people in administration in healthcare who've been kind of out of that process for a while, to where that's not what they believe in anymore, or they may still believe in it, but there are other things that are more important. So remember, when you're dealing with these kind of responses, you got to make sure that you can't just stereotype the responses, but you've got to kind of know that's what's happening when you walk in there. While we focused on the care and duty responses, there's a number of other areas as well. rather than just memorizing a bunch of different terms and trying to memorize that sort of thing, it's important to point out what's important in the bigger picture. And what's important in the bigger picture is knowing where someone comes from rather than what their particular perspective actually is. What's important here is the bigger picture. Knowing where someone's perspective is so you know how to deal with that particular person. If someone's basically based in their perspective on divine rights, and you realize that, you're going to know how to deal with them. Because no matter what happens, they're generally going to be focused on religion. Now, what that means is, and I need to point this out, is somebody who is focused on religion does not necessarily mean they're religious. And that kind of gets missed a lot of times. What that means is, like, say somebody like an atheist, and that atheist happens to be somebody who's constantly focused on religion or the lack thereof. That's their paradigm. That's what's important to them. That's what they're always going to be focused on. And that's what you need to know. Because if you know that, you're dealing with them on any other issue, and that's always the thing that they're going to come down to, well, then you know it, and you can deal with them in a better way. It's probably really important to point out that a lot of our international diplomacy is based on ethical communication. Think about that for a moment. When we deal with foreign nations, we tend to attribute a lot of our reactions to them based on how we perceive their paradigm to be. As such, we treat people from, like, say, the Middle East often under the paradigm of divine rights, convinced that that's how they must actually believe. Whereas there are certain countries in the Middle East that don't actually fall under that, but we still treat them that way. Like a country like Egypt. Egypt may have a divine rights segment to them, but mostly they tend to react as a duty concept country, which is a country that's under a military regime. Yet we still treat them as divine rights because sometimes we're not the best people to figure out what our perspective should be. I could get a lot more into detail here, but this really isn't a course on international relations or even on politics for that nature. But I just want to give an example of the different kinds of ways that ethical communication is used. If you understand where someone comes from, and you understand how that person thinks, you might have a better idea and a better way of actually dealing with that person on a personal basis. But the disclaimer, remember, you always have to understand the person a little better if you actually want to attribute paradigms to that person. In other words, just because you saw something one time doesn't necessarily mean they have that particular paradigm. That's why we generally make our mistake in international relations. Try not to do it yourself. Instead, get to know somebody. Talk to him or her. Because that's how you start to understand other people. And from there, you can use other tools like ethical communication to figure out how someone tends to be over time. After all, that's the reason we're here. We're social beings and we communicate with other people, and that's what we do to survive. Armed with the right tools, there's not a lot you can't do. I'm Dwayne Gundrum, and I want to thank you for listening to my demonstration on ethical communication, and hope you join me again.